thank you for putting on your outdoor clothes, if they even fit. We appreciate your being here. I'm Jessica Seigel. I'm the Deadline Club Events Chair, and I'm a journalism professor at NYU. This is our first in-person talk in more than 2 years, and we're thrilled. You're here. Before we dive in, some thanks are due to recent NYU grad Izzy McMahon, who is on camera. She is a fantastic journalist. No looking for a job, just saying. And Ploy Tannum-Borson is at the door. Thank you, Ploy. Can you hear that's a round for her? Also at NYU, still undergrad, and to Deadliner volunteer Chris Ma. Chris, where are you? There he is. Columnist USA Today. Yes, they do door work. Thank you. Huge shout out to Andrew Owen and Alex of Postman Books. They are based at Chelsea Market. Folks, this is the indie bookseller right here selling books. Please, after this, buy the book, get the signing, support your local bookseller, think holidays, the whole thing. Of course, huge thanks to Salmagundi Club. This is our longtime headquarters. And when you join the Deadline Club, you also get privileges here, which are incredible: private dining room, billiards, many creative events, art, and of course, us. The Deadline Club, I think many of you know, some not, is the New York chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. We're the largest chapter nationally, and perhaps that's no surprise, because New York has the largest concentration of journalists in the nation. And then, of course, there's all the New Yorkers in here who want to write a book. And so, in New York, that's pretty much everybody, right? We're a city of words, books, and opinions. Lots of opinions. But publishing is tough. Can you publish without perishing? Our truly illustrious panelists will tell us you can. And from commentaries to books, we're going to do it all. And not simply how to get the book deal, but also the big question is, do you have to write a book? Will your life be okay if you do not? And it's something that we need to consider. And while we're pondering that, we invite you to tweet. Panelists' Twitters and website links can all be found all on one page at deadlineclub.org on our homepage right there. And so we're going to do introductions. I'm going to introduce them individually and start with an opening question that's just going to go time sequence, which is, how about that first deal? So I am starting Aaron Foley. He represents us journalists with our guilty secrets of wanting to write fiction. So, Aaron, thank you for doing it for us. He's a senior editor at PBS NewsHour who moved to New York City 2 years ago from Detroit to found the Black Media Initiative at CUNY J School. He's written 2 nonfiction books, this guy's not lying around, and now his first debut novel, Boys Come First, follows 3 Black, gay, millennial men striving in Motown. Publishers Weekly called it funny, naughty, comforting. Aaron, you told me when we talked that adult queer fiction has long been disregarded as a category, like it wasn't even, and now it's only now just sort of growing up. So what was involved for you in making that leap to fiction and getting a novel for a category not considered to exist?
Thanks, Jessica. I think the big reason why is because I think the natural instinct of journalists is to tell stories, right? And we always want to tell stories that are often unheard and bring light and attention to an issue that needs light, you know? So you can't but I mean, I always had the itch to do creative writing. I think everybody that kind of picks this career in journalism, you know, we kind of face that choice between, like, do we get the English degree or do we get the journalism degree, right? And so, and you know, which one is going to pay bills? And yeah, that's a whole different conversation. But no, I mean, I saw a lot of parallels between journalism and writing a novel in terms of, just like with journalism with the novel, I wanted to educate, I wanted to inform, I wanted to bring attention to something that I thought needed attention, but also entertaining. Not to say that journalism can't be entertaining, but there was kind of a rare opportunity here that I don't always get on the the journalism side. So that was sort of part of what drove me to do this.
Okay, and can you just tell us about what it took to get that first deal?
What it took to get the first deal? Quite honestly, roundabout way. With Belt Publishing, they're an indie publisher based out of Cleveland that started in 2012, I believe. So they're still new and very ambitious, very underdog. I will say just very quickly, a lot of indie presses and university presses are kind of doing the yeoman's work of publishing a lot of marginalized voices and authors. No, I had done 2 nonfiction books with Belt and sort of had that relationship existing already, but Belt had only done nonfiction. They had done like anthologies and single author titles all about the Midwest and the Rust Belt, hence why it's called Belt Publishing. And so I queried with agents and publishers and all that, and I got a lot of rejections. But Belt was always on standby. They said, even though we had never published fiction before, we'd still have this relationship with you. And so if you want to try it with us, we can try it. And we saw a lot of the success with, I don't know if anybody's read The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Filion. What a lot of people don't know is that came out on a university press, and Disha had a very similar story in terms of also querying her book about a subject, that is often rejected by a lot of the larger outlets. And this one university press in West Virginia took a chance on her, and it blew up. And so we tried to, I think a lot of people now are trying to walk in that same kind of strategy in terms of having a closer relationship with the publisher and author, and also just kind of marketing on this idea of like, it doesn't always have to be that giant like 6-figure deal with like Flatiron or something like that. You can have success, you can have your voice heard, your story amplified through a non-traditional way, I guess. And so that's how I ended up doing with Belt, and it seems to be working. So.
Great lessons for us all, and thank you. Now we're going to go to the memoirist, not a trained journalist. I first met Midwest-bred Emmy Enfield at our co-writing space, Paragraph, years ago. She was a Google software engineer with growing credits by Slate, Rumpus, more, and she told me she was writing a memoir, and I was like, oh, that's nice. Well, Acceptance debuted in August to raves. I read it and honestly could not put it down. I'm not kidding. I didn't want to talk to anyone who was reading the book. Remarkable, hailed the New York Times. Quote, the debut of a formidable talent, says The Nation. It tells of her clawing herself up from home. No, it's true.
I'm going to Google that when I get home.
It's on the publicity. Okay. It tells of, it was on Amazon page. Okay, someone put it there. It tells of her, I hope it's true, but it is. It tells of her clawing herself up from homeless foster teen. The story is incredible. I didn't know any of that. You were not oversharing. Incredible. To full scholarship, full ride at Harvard. She faced fierce naysayers to her writing growing up from people close to her, and yet she persisted, and she landed a memoir deal in one of the most competitive categories, which is memoir. And so, Emmy, congratulations. It's very exciting. How did you actually get this book deal?
I started writing Acceptance in 2015, and at the time, people said, nobody wants to read about college, nobody wants to read about foster care or mental health or teenagers. And so I was driven to get the book out. I started querying about 2 years in, and I got a lot of requests for partial manuscripts and full manuscripts, but passes from probably about 100 agents. But along the way, one of the agency assistants who read it said, we don't publish memoir that's just straightforward memoir, we only do research books. And so if you want to add research, send it back to us. So I tried really hard to do that. I sent it back to them. She had left, but the new agency assistant forwarded it to her at her new job at Penguin Press. And 4 years after that, she was my editor. After more querying, eventually getting an agent, we sent it back to her, and she became the person. And along the way, I published essays that were related to the book, but actually, frankly, none of them really helped. I think it was helpful. I think it was helpful to be like, oh, I have published a piece, and to be like, here's an essay that's a proof of concept for this book. But I didn't have any material impact on selling the book, which I sold on a full manuscript about 5 years into writing it.
So you had to cough the whole thing up.
Yeah, I had to cough the whole thing up, and I had to do all the research in advance, which at first I thought, I'm not going to research this, and then I started digging into the truth of my past, and it was its own rabbit hole.
Highly recommended read. We'll hear more. And now for the journalist. You know who you are, Lena Zhdovic. She's born in Russia. She is a well-known science writer, Smithsonian, New York Times, Scientific America, who has won numerous awards, including from the Deadline Club, just saying, covering topics ranging from COVID to, I can honestly say, a real load of crap. Some good shit. Mary Roach dubs Lena's first book, The Other Dark Matter, The Science and Business of Turning Waste into Wealth and Health, which debuted in late 2021 to strong sales for a book about shit, Lena, strong sales, narrative, reporting, reportage. Lena, how did you go from writing, I've known you for years, she is cranking it out for all these publications, never a book. Tell us how it actually happened that you reached that dream.
Well, I think my path to the book was probably more convoluted than for many other journalists, because I landed in this country at the age of 21 without speaking a word of English. Wow. But I knew I was a writer since I was 5. I knew it because I started writing before I knew letters, and as soon as I knew letters, I started writing in Russian. So I land here, and everybody and their brother, all my well-meaning relatives tell me, forget it, it will never happen. And I'm like, but Nabokov? And they're like, you're not Nabokov. So I go to Polytechnic University, I get a degree in computer science, and I do my computer science job, and I hate it every single morning. I'm just going to die doing this job. I need to do something else. So eventually I give it home. So I take classes. By the way, this is that my teacher sitting like right next to me. I take classes, I take more classes. I write 4 novels, which I can't sell. My agent at the time started introducing me to her friends, saying, "This is Lena. She writes good books, but I can't sell them." And I go, "This is fucked up. And anywhere." So English, journalism. I go back to school and I get a degree in journalism. And then it starts happening, like Jessica said. There are things to write, there are people to interview. People actually want to publish science writing, medical writing, health stories. And while I'll do all that, I go back to my childhood when my grandfather actually used to fertilize our farm with the contents of our septic system. Why? Because he had to grow food with whatever he had. And growing up, I thought everybody did that. So imagine my shocker when I grew up and learned that most people just flush it down the toilet. So one thing leads to another. I talk to my future agent, who at the moment is transitioning from being an editor at Macmillan to being an agent. And she goes, "I like that idea. Let's write a proposal." And I'm like, "Yeah, I've written 4 books. Proposal, right." But she stuck with it. She liked the idea. She kind of coached me through. She periodically, called me and said, "Well, when's the new version coming?" And one day when we met for coffee again, she whipped out a contract, and I almost fell off my chair because I didn't think this was going to happen. I went dancing. And then she sold it in about 2 months. I must admit, the top tier publishers passed on it because they liked the idea, they liked the writing, they thought it was really unique, but they didn't know how to discuss it at their marketing meetings. They didn't know what to put on the cover. So we went to university presses, and we had 3 bids from 3 different places, and hence there is The Other Dark Matter.
Terrific, great story. And that's University of Chicago?
Yep.
Okay, not shabby, folks, right?
You're so cute.
That's Tiffany Drayton, who also just recently got her first memoir. So, hi, Tiffany. Okay, you can heckle, it's okay. Now we're going to go for the author writing guru, and by the way, Tiffany is also Susan Shapiro, another of Susan Shapiro's students. Susan Shapiro is a legendary writing professor, I do mean legendary, and author, co-author of 18 books, whose students have sold 170 titles in the plus in the last decade. She pulls together her advice in the Byline Bible for articles, and most recently, the Book Bible. Listen to what the deck is How to Sell Your Manuscript, no matter what genre, without going broke or insane. To avoid insanity, obviously you're going to buy the book in the back. Sue, 20 years ago, I met you, and I remember the time you were struggling to get that first deal, finally landing the memoir, 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, in 2004. How did you get over the hump to become a book writing machine who is the envy of New York City?
Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
And by the way, Lena got the biggest rave I've ever seen in the New York Review of Books, like 10,000 words of just genius. I'm jealous. Well, therapy helped a lot, seriously. And so I was moved to New York to study poetry, and I was a failed poet. After 10 years, my mentor told me, you have too many words, not enough music. And but thank God he was an editor at the New York Times who said I had more poetry in my prose than in my poems. So that led me to essays. And then I decided, after I gave up poetry, I was going to be a novelist, and that didn't happen after 7 years of rejections. And then I wasn't funny enough to be a humorist. So I basically just kept bouncing around. But then one of the things I talk about in Book Bible is I didn't really have an overview of different genres that one might, that somebody could break into easily. And what I found was that poetry with a capital P and an adult novel are probably the hardest areas to break in, and I had much better luck with nonfiction. So I had luck with memoirs, self-help. I did a pop culture history of Barbie. I did 2 research books on Bosnia. One was a middle grade. So one of the things I talk to my students about and that I write about in Book Bible is by being a little bit more flexible, and a lot of therapy, but a lot of being flexible and understanding which genres are easier. I also did have luck selling short pieces, and I always say to someone, if you're just starting out, 3 pages is much easier to sell than 300. So I definitely had short pieces that got interest from editors and agents, and actually Tiffany had a great piece, Black American Refugee, in the New York Times, and I think 2 weeks later had a book deal. So I always say, first try a short piece. Obviously it doesn't always get you a huge deal with the Viking Penguin, but so that helped me. And really the therapy helped a lot. It was an addiction therapist who helped me quit smoking and drinking and drugs, and I then became addicted to book deals and writing. And so now I just do nothing else.
I can confirm that Sue is a workaholic. It's just all night long. Okay, thank you, Sue. I mean, what else? What other kind of addiction is a good addiction, you know? Okay, and now we're going to do the powers behind books. You know what's coming, you guys, you powers. Prannoy Sarcar is a senior editor at Little Brown who was brought in to expand their nonfiction titles after stints at St. Martin's, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster. He has big idea books, and they are, that cross many disciplines from history and politics to race and gender. There's Muckraking American Kleptocracy, Profit and Punishment by St. Louis Dispatch Pulitzer winner Tony Messenger, and this summer's unlikely blockbuster, If Nietzsche Were a Narwhal, which uses animal biology to ask, are humans really so smart? Well, I can say that Prannoy's authors really are so smart. From Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, many other. That's a big bar. Prannoy, what can you tell for us in this room, how we can get a first book done when we're perhaps not at that very, very high bar? How do we reach it?
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for, I was trying to take notes to see if I could make a connection to everybody on the panel, and I think I actually might succeed. And it actually might be a perfect springboard to your question, in part because years ago when I was at Picador, I published an anthology of Bell Publishing essays. And I just discovered shortly before sitting on this panel that Aaron was one of the essayists in that collection, which made me very happy. I thought the Bell Publishing essay collection, which we did publish with Anne Trubeck, who's the publisher of Bell Publishing, was wonderful. And those essays were wonderful. And I was actually at the event where many of the writers spoke. I'm not sure if you were there. I were unable to attend, but all of the essays were great. And I do work in Big Five publishing, and I did try to write a book on shit. I had a hard time for the very reasons, because everybody kept laughing, and nobody could take it seriously. I failed to buy the book on shit, so I'm very glad that you've succeeded in publishing one. The one that I tried to buy was a Kanaga, so you were also first to market, which is excellent. The 4 to 5 years that you spent working on your manuscript is also reflective of the long game that is involved in this, that I think is very important. I mean, perseverance is extremely important. And also the sort of extraordinary uniqueness of the story itself that really nobody else can write. I mean, having that kind of, there's two types of nonfiction. When you step away from memoir, it's like you want a subject expertise, but a lot of people develop that expertise over many, many years. I mean, some of your favorite writers didn't start until, 15, 20, 30 years in. And in fact, famous writers like Jane Eyre have only published like 3 or 4 books, and they've been active for 30, 40 years. Mel hasn't been introduced yet, but I actually turned down the book that she's got sitting on there. Mistake of mine, because I thought that we would all return to office because COVID would be short. That turned out to be wrong.
What was that?
So that just goes to show that editors, power brokers are not infallible and often wrong. I've also done books with Mel, and actually, what I would say is that what often we're looking for is one of the authors you didn't mention, but who I do have on a contract is like someone like Wood Pearlstein, who's an established reporter or an established historian. But they all began somewhere, and developing subject expertise, categorical understanding of the areas in which you want to publish, developing networking, connecting with why the materials of your memoir is, like what are the other memoirs that are being published, why they're being published, why are they working, focusing on craft, and also then doing, broadening out your own sort of entrepreneurial understanding of like what does it mean to be a writer professionally, as well as on a craft level, I think sort of sets you up to sort of anticipate the questions that often come up in a context, like in a Big Five context specifically. And I also certainly agree that independent presses are ground zero for a lot of more creative publishing, in part because they have, in many ways, some are nonprofits, some are connected to universities, are operating in a more romantic model that we used to see 50, 60 years ago from traditional publishers. The new publishers have become far more corporate, bottom line focused, which has, I think, created a much more conservative mindset, which is why there's been a higher bar to pass for agents, so you can't just talk about shit and say that's a great idea and let's just do it, unfortunately. But there is, I think, a path to, the process itself can be, you wrote 4 novels, that was quite something. There's some famous novels, I won't mention them out loud, but one of them is won the Nobel, who wrote 20 novels before they sold the first. So, I think the process is very much a part of it, and the deal is also not necessarily the beginning of something transformative as well. I've certainly interacted with MFA professors around the country who have said, oh yeah, have you heard from so-and-so, their editor at some publisher. I have not been able to connect with them. I published a book with them like 5 years ago, and I don't really know what's next. And so, it's just a long game, and I think that developing that kind of resiliency and understanding both how to develop articulate your own understanding of the categories and the space in which you're operating with, the people who have come before you, and also working within that space, and how they're succeeding and why they're succeeding and what they're doing, and how you can sort of move into that in a very unique way, I think always sort of amplifies or optimizes your own opportunities to get deals yourself.
Wonderful. Bruno is basically supporting the long game, and whether that's a short piece or long piece. And now we are going to go to the Uber agent, Melissa Flashman, who is originally a Southern girl from Lexington, Kentucky. She wisely escaped an English PhD program, then landed in literary agenting 20 years ago, ICM, Trident. Now she's a leading agent at Janklow Nesbitt, handling much awarded journalists who are indeed changing the conversation, which is her focus. Okay, Out of Office, About the Future of Work by Charlie Wurzel and Helen Peterson. Golden Gates on Affordable Housing by Times reporter Connor Doherty. And this summer's big hit, and I do mean big, The Dawn of Everything is a new history of humanity in just 700 pages. Okay, can you give us an example of some of these first book deals, a first book deal, and how it sort of came together, something concrete that could be a model for us in this room?
Yeah, so a lot of first book deals for writers can often be fairly established journalists. So Charlie Wurzel, who's the co-writer of Out of Office, when I sold it, had a more or less weekly column in the New York Times. He's pretty young, but he's been doing high-profile journalism for over a decade, and he and his partner had been working remotely in Montana before the pandemic. So they, were like, we've been doing this successfully. We were sort of the test case, and they did all the research, and honestly, they're probably the best proposal writers I've ever worked with. They went to a fire station or in the forest for a weekend and wrote one of the best proposals I've seen, and we did lots of meetings and sold it. So that was like a very, very straightforward path to publishing. But another writer you mentioned, Connor Doherty, who's also at the New York Times. He's on Sunday Business. He and I started talking because he had a piece that I noticed on non-compete clauses, which doesn't sound like the most riveting idea. I had been changing jobs and was worried, about my own contract, and so it was something that was on my mind. And he had a piece on it, and we started talking, both sort of realizing that this was not a book. It was sort of the classic non-compete clauses is what a publisher would say. That's a magazine article or a newspaper article, not a book. A classic idea. But he had a big splashy piece in the Times that I had also read called "The Rise of the 3-Hour Commute," and his beat was more or less, in addition to these contracts, was affordable housing in California, which is the sort of most expensive area of the country, and just sort of first in the water for all these problems. So we worked together for several months to cook up that proposal, and he I will say had an agent years ago and had tried to sell a novel. So he has the soul of a novelist. He's totally a character-driven journalist, which you might not think of always when you think of hard-nosed business journalists, but he found a really compelling cast of characters for his book. A nun who had been buying up housing in the Bay Area to keep it affordable. This sort of anarchist from Philadelphia who had been a squatter punk, who was very much at the forefront of what is now the YIMBY, the Yes in My Backyard movement. Various politicians. So it had like a really kind of like Hollywood-ready cast of characters that we were able to sort of bake a larger story around. So those are pretty typical examples. Sometimes writers are subject experts, like the authors of the 30,000-year history of humanity, an archaeologist and an anthropologist activist. So, those are the two. But I also do memoirs, which I think is one of the hardest categories. So hats off to the memoirists, Emmy and everyone out there. It's a very hard category to sell books in, and but it's also one of my favorite to read. And a little bit of fiction, which is also very, very, very difficult. My colleagues do a lot more fiction than I do.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I mean, we've heard long game, also from Melissa, brainstorming, the importance of that. Maybe the idea you think is a book may not be, and it could be something else. Okay, now we're gonna do some bullet rounds. We have a very full, illustrious panel, so we're gonna do shot through. Let's see if we can do it. It can be a little stressful. Okay, we've heard a lot about rejection. We're going to go down the line, and for the writers, it's going to be how do you deal with rejection? Like, how do you deal with it? It seems to be part of the job. Like, how do you keep going? And then for pronoun and Alyssa, when we come to you, we'll just go down the line. What projects did you love but couldn't get off the ground other than something about shits? Okay, so let's just start with Aaron, and then next we'll go in the other direction. How do you deal with rejection?
How do I deal with rejection? I mean, not to be flippant, but I am a journalist of color, and I've been rejected for many jobs that I thought I was qualified for, so I've gotten used to it in my whole career. But yes, so so it's natural at this point. I think belief in yourself and kind of being a little bit cocky and being like, I think I have something here. Somebody needs to hear it. I'm sort of driven by two quotes. One is and I'm totally going to paraphrase it, but the Toni Morrison quote: "If there's a book you want to read, then you have to write it." It's kind of I know I paraphrased it, but it's kind of my liberty. And I totally forgot the second one. That's
a great quote, right?
Yeah.
Write the book you want to read.
Yeah, write the book you want to read. And just knowing that somebody is waiting for that story. Quite honestly, and it's a little bit psychological and mental for me, I am very hesitant to kind of own my work out loud, saying like, oh, I did a really good job, I don't like talking about that, but when I did put the book out and it started to gain some traction and I started to get tagged in Instagram posts and Twitter comments and being invited to book clubs and being invited to podcasts and getting kind of like these personal notes from readers, saying, thank you for writing this, I saw myself in it, that sort of thing. That to me kind of rings the same as when you do write a piece, a journalistic piece, and you get the emails from readers like, oh, I really learned something here, thank you. That just lets me know that, mission accomplished. So if I can just kind of keep those sort of North Stars, then I can get past the rejection.
Mission accomplished, yeah. No. Books you had to pass on and what that might say for us.
I will first say, and Pranay will echo this, every book that you see on the bestseller list ever was passed on by agents, by editors. Every bestseller I represented was passed on by multiple people. It's just every book is not the right book for every editor and publisher. The book I couldn't sell that just still kills me is a book by a Portland-based journalist. This was many years ago. It was right before the show Portlandia came on, and it was on Portland, and it was this grand, sweeping history, sort of almost like weirdly cross-partisan history of Portland. That was a city that was the only city that rejected Robert Moses's urban growth boundary, and it was, I think, a coalition of like a conservationist Republican governor and a liberal Democratic mayor, and a wonderful coalition of people. And it was a big food story. It was the story of how Portland became this like award-winning food and wine region. And great writer. Had already had a book with Riverhead, and publishers, it was the recession, this was 2010, every publisher was laying off editors, and they were just like, Portland, it's just too regional. And so that was, I still think about it because it was a terrific proposal, and we got very close, and I know it was like, it's the sort of book that he'd be on every podcast right now, but it was the wrong moment for that book.
Yeah, fascinating. It was just not the right time. Lena, how do you deal with rejection?
I think I started dealing with the rejections like really early on, because when you just land here and you try to go to a party and you try to interact with people and you can't put two words together and you can't understand what other people are saying, and you lose all of your ability to quote your favorite poets or writers. As a writer, you memorize by heart, but you just basically kind of like dumb and mute, and you have to accept it. You be dumb and mute and slowly climb your way up.
Yeah.
And this is what I did the first 10 years of living in the city. With my first novel, I counted all my rejections, and I reached 250. Wow. And I think I still have them in paper form, someplace in some big box in my house. I saved it because I wanted to make a big collage of them when my first book was finally published. With the second book, I didn't count. The third one, I didn't count. The fourth, I didn't bother. And then by the time I was a freelance journalist and pitching stories, those rejections used to come a couple times a day. It was like, okay, next. But I think in part what they did to me is I had such a low expectations that I didn't really think, I literally thought I had like a curse on me when it came to books. So, but once you sort of get over it, it becomes easy. You just, it's part of every freelance journalist's life, as some of us know. You just move on to the next thing.
Gotta keep a thick skin. I tell my students that. Thick skin. Okay, we are trying to do bullet round. So Susan, I know that you were a master. How do you deal with rejection?
I have a quick story that I'm not supposed to tell, but first my Bosnian-less co-author, Kenneth Trubincevic, is here with his son. Hi, thanks for coming. It's his first book.
With his baby!
Yes. Who we met because of the book. So great things happen when we publish a book. Okay, so I'll tell a story I'm not supposed to tell. So I'm 43 years old, manically depressed. I'm a teacher and all my students are getting published and I can't publish a book. I'm like a wedding planner who can't get married. And so I'm complaining to my shrink, and my shrink says to me, I was especially jealous because I had a novelist friend who just got a huge deal and a friend who got a big nonfiction deal, and I was just fuming and jealous, and so my shrink said, why don't you take one out to lunch, one out to dinner, and ask their advice? Tell them what's going on. I've been trying to sell a book for 7 years, wasn't having any luck, a novel, so I did that. So I go out to lunch with Larry and I tell him I'm working on this book for 7 years, not having any luck. Do you have any advice? He said, okay, I'm gonna tell you the truth, but don't tell anyone. After I was done with my proposal, I hired this woman named Sally, who was an editor at Doubleday for 20 years as a ghost editor, and she kicked it into shape, and then I sold it. So I said, interesting. He said, here's her number, but don't tell anyone. I said, okay. Go out to dinner with Yona. I took them out. Went out to dinner with Yona. She's a big deal for a novel. I told her my whole story. She says, okay, just between us, there's this great ghost editor named Sally who used to work at Okay, so they give me her number, so I call Sally, and she's like $2,000. So I go to my shrink, and I'm like, are you crazy? I can't afford that. The whole reason I've been trying to sell a book is because I need money because I'm broke. And he said, are you an idiot or what? Like, there's a joke about, like, God throwing you, like, ways to save yourself. He's like, yeah, so I basically put it on my credit card and taught 3 extra classes, and I hired Sally, and it was $2,300 to edit the whole book, which is about 230 pages, which I thought was astronomical. And then it sold to Random House for $50,000, and that was my first book, and I did 3 in a row for them, and then I had foreign rights and film rights, and anyway, so now I swear by ghost editors. So everybody, a lot of editors and agents say, don't say that out loud, but why not? Because, so I had a great writing group and I had really smart critics, but I just didn't know how to write a book. I could write small, but I just couldn't figure out how to structure a book. So I will say, if you try classes and you try a writing group and you're still having trouble, there is an alternative, which is you can actually hire. I only like to work with either editors, agents, or former editors and agents who really know, or someone who's like someone like Lena, for example, who knows science books. She might be a good person to work with, but you only want to hire someone whose work you admire, and I swear by that. So I was 43 and I sold the first book.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, Pronoy. Rejection.
Yeah, so the funny thing about rejection is that, and I think this goes back to Aaron's point, is that the most frustrating thing for an editor, and I think this is reflected also with agents who deal with editors in the big five, is that they're just so conservative, and they will not make decisions on whimsy until it works, and then everybody is like, how can we replicate that success? So for many years I wanted to do a book similar to the new Jim Crow, and nobody was like that, nobody's gonna want to read that, and then it happened, and then everybody was like, how can we replicate the new Jim Crow, which by the way came from an indie press, the New Press, which is a wonderful press, and it was ignored by mainstream media, but Michelle Alexander powered through. I also, for many years, really wanted to do a book on hunter-gatherers, and there was a bunch of proposals coming in on like hunter-gathering parenting, and I had known years ago that there was this really successful one. I'm like, you know, not an obvious candidate for parenting, but you know, just keep an eye out on what you think is going to work. And I just knew that, you know, the age we live in, finding non-Western models to raise your children would work. And so I was like, really gung-ho about this hunter-gatherer parenting book, and everyone was like, you're out of your mind. That sounds horrible. That went on to become a bestseller. And then I remember reading this proposal by the scientist who had done this work that I didn't fully understand at the time, but I was like, it just seems pretty transformational to me. And I remember saying, we should really buy it. It seems really great. And they were like, yeah, but she has already done an NPR, so like maybe the ODS passed her by. Her name was Jennifer Doudna. She won the Nobel Prize for that idea that I didn't fully understand 2 years ago. To this day, I'm like, okay, well, it seems like that NPR interview was just maybe the first of like 100 things that would happen in her life, including the Nobel. So, and one of the things that I wanted to mention is that like there's a lot of editors that get really passionate, but there are just so many headwinds that get in the way of often trying to make a case, because we're not monolithic. Whether it's, you know, I mean, even the Narwhal book, I mean, like, you know, he's a biologist in Nova Scotia and like lives on a farm, and it just took weeks and weeks to convince, I think I eventually, I bought a book actually at another publisher at Macmillan, called The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit, and I was only able to buy that book because he was a clinical psychologist who had been studying bullshit in the lab, but which for the most part people thought was a relatively dull idea. But I thought, well, if I called it The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit, maybe I could bypass their concern. And in fact, they liked the title, but they allowed me to buy it, which is completely arbitrary, because when Adam Grant blurred the book, they were like, why is a serious psychologist blurring the book? And I said, because the book is a serious book of psychology, which I told you from the beginning. So, you know, rejection is part of, you know, so much part of all of our lives often, and I look at sometimes and it's not even a question of like, you know, were the editors correct? It's like, what I hate is the sort of overcorrection that happens. It's like, oh, it can't work. Like a book like Emmys can't work, and then it does work, and now everybody wants to buy the next acceptance, and it's like, or like I remember, I was a little younger when Evicted was going around, and I remember reading it, and I was like, this is like unbelievable. And I was like, yeah, but like, who cares about eviction? And well, it turns out a lot of people do. And then now, like, you get every proposal, anything related to housing is like, the next Evicted. And it's like, okay, well, you know, so it's this sort of conservative mindset that is frustrating, and I guarantee you at the editorial level, it's extremely frustrating. We're constantly fighting these tailwinds where it's like, we want to replicate success that happened last year, which is like paradoxical in a way, because, well, if it just happened last year, why would readers want to read the exact same thing the next year? So
well,
to try to push forward.
Pronoy, thank you very much for this important comments, and you just have to keep going, and we've had people here who talk about the small press and the importance of the small press and also small articles. And by the way, I do want to just give some props to Pronoy. He named the book, If Nietzsche Were Narwhal. We were talking about it, wrote it on a napkin, and it had some not so awesome name, and that was his name. So the title can really sell, and it seems like that can make a big difference. Emmy, you have been through the ringer. How do you deal with rejection?
I started writing acceptance in 2015, and so that was before Educated came out. And so basically I was querying the book and pitching it to people in 2017, in 2018, and I don't think it would have sold if Educated hadn't come out. And I also write about sexual assault in there, and like people were like, absolutely no one in the world cares or wants to read about this, because it was pre-Me Too, pre-Know My Name. And so for me, a lot of the dealing with rejection was biding my time and putting in the work before people believed in it, because it's almost like when something is timely, it's too late. So I was in Susan Shapiro's class as well, and I started writing about Google, where I was a software engineer for 4 years. I started writing about it in 2018, and I remember emailing Susan and being like, I think I should write this op-ed, like, what do you think? And Susan was like, don't do it. Like, you still work there, don't do it. And I ended up writing various versions of this as the news cycle changed, and finally, like 3 years later, I sent it out. I sent it to 10 places, and only Slate and the New York Times responded. And Slate was like, could we get on a phone call to maybe discuss? And the New York Times was like, we want it. And it was one of the most read op-eds of 2021. But I have been working on it for 3 years, right? And I have been working, and then when the time came, it was ready. And I think the same for acceptance, where, I would have loved to sell a book proposal years ago, but in hindsight, I'm really grateful that I could not, and that I had to spend all this time working on it, because I didn't realize that once you get a deal, like, the clock is ticking, and that book will come out on the day it's supposed to come out, and it doesn't matter if it's trash or not. Like, at that point, the money is spent, like, the publicity is lined up, like, your book is gonna happen. And so I feel really grateful for all the feedback that I got before I had my editor, who was making me feel good. Like, she was brutal, but she made me feel good. Like, parents, strangers, other people, they gave me the truth about how readers were going to respond to the story so that I could adjust it accordingly.
I just want to add one thing. I love the piece, absolutely, when I read it, but what I said was, you still work there now. So are you ready to leave? And you said, I read about the new school and it screwed up a 25-year job. It's very hard to leave it. If you're working at a place, writing in the New York Times how much they suck is not a brilliant career move. But by the way, what was so cool was that when your piece ran, you were not only leaving, it became like this great, like announcement of your book. So
It
that
had
was
1
exciting.
million views and sparked a walkout at Google. Okay, is that not completely accurate?
It had more than that.
Sorry. Okay, how many views did it have?
It had like 2 million in the first 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was the front page of Reddit.
Better to undersell than exaggerate in our business, so
Thank you.
Okay, guys, listen, I want to start question and answer from this audience at 8 p.m., no matter what happens. Because we're gonna stop at 8:15 to mingle some more and buy books and just see each other. So when I say bullet round, folks, I mean bullets. Okay, we're going through, and I want to see silver bullets here. Okay. What's a don't or a no-no? Okay, we're going to start with Emmy, and then we're going to go down here, and we just want don'ts and no-nos. No thinking, don'ts and no-nos. Emmy.
To me, thinking that just selling a book, any book, is going to make you happy.
That's going to be hard to top. Bruno.
So when you decide to talk, you get an agent, you're proposing, say you're a journalist and you're talking about the book, the agent's the editors that you're talking to are gonna ask for your interest or what you're modeling your book after. You told me to tell this, so I'm just gonna use this as my bullet. And I remember telling an author who had published a pretty interesting piece on like the wealthy buying up insane real estate in like the Northwest to basically create their own Westworld. And it was a completely bizarre story. And I said, who's a sort of a model for you? And they said Charles Dickens. And I said, okay, well, it's very clear to me that like you're clearly just not reading anything that's come out in the last 50 years. Like you really don't need to say Charles Dickens as a model for like a work of like contemporary reporting on like the uber wealthy in North Dakota. So like a no is to like show like pretty transparently that you're just like really not paying attention to what your colleagues, competitors, enemies, or fans are even doing. If Charles Dickens is the only thing that you can come up with as a potential model for your work of nonfiction, which has nothing to do with Dickens at all.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Don't write in a vacuum. I cannot tell you how many students come to me with either essays or books, and they say, I haven't had a drink in 3 weeks, and I'm going to write about it. And I'm like, have you ever been to a bookstore? Like, there are 20 billion gazillion books on that. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but you have to do research. You have to Google. You have to go to the bookstore. You have to understand that if 1,000 books have already been written on a subject, then you have to find your niche, and you can't just write anything you feel like writing without understanding that, you know, who came before you and how do you add to the conversation.
Great, these are great notes. Yeah, Lena.
Don't think that you scored when you find an agent. Don't think that you scored when they sell the book. Don't think that you scored when you write the goddamn thing. Because when it finally comes out, that's when you really have to work hard. And suddenly you have to learn how to be a completely new person. You have to learn how to be a talk show host, a comedian, how to move on camera. Jesus, I looked at myself how I moved on camera the first time. I wanted to die. And you have to write the next book. Because what good is one book, right? You're a book writer, so you have to write 30 while marketing that first one. I'm doing this right now. And there's a third one in my mind. Jesus.
This will be very short and technical. If you're querying agents, query only one agent at every agency, or at each. Do not query more than one agent at an agency.
By the way, that also goes for magazines. You can only query one editor at a magazine or publication, not two. Your name will be mud. Okay, Aaron, don't.
2 quick bullets. One, don't compare yourself to another writer. That is very cliche, but it is very true. The other is, as journalists, don't be, did I lose it? Okay, don't be afraid to push yourself creatively and push the boundaries in the book versus the work that whatever you do on page or on digital. There are things that are in my novel that could never ever fly as like a newspaper piece or whatever, and part of my journey has had to be to kind of straddle the line between, okay, here's my journalistic work from 9 to 5, and here is my novel that is after dark, weekends and after dark. So yeah.
Okay, this is awesome don'ts. Okay, and now we're going to do another quickie, and then we're going to go to the audience. And this one is, what's next for you, or what's coming up in the industry? Whatever. I mean, like, what are you doing, or what do you think will be the next wave for Pronoy and Melissa? And let's start from Emmy.
I love the answer that we had here about how after you publish the book, you have to be a whole new person and do all this stuff you never imagined doing, and that's what I'm up to.
Are you working on it?
Oh, I'm working on a lot of essays right now, actually.
Okay.
With some book ideas in the future.
Excellent. Okay, again, starting up again with the small ones to build to the big one again. You have to rejuvenate. You can't just pump this stuff out unless you're Sue. Okay, Pronoy.
I've got quite a few books coming out next year, but one I'll mention is called Ground Game. It's about how a bunch of insurgents who did not believe that the election was won fairly have started an entire national strategy to capture the precincts at the local level all around the country. It was broken by a ProPublica reporter who has since moved to the Washington Post, and they believe that, or they have sort of resurrected this obscure weirdo from the Tea Party days who basically said all politics is precincts, and if you can capture the precincts, you can capture politics at the state and national level. So they have all become precinct committee members, and they're going to run through their first trial run is the midterms, and then they're going to try it for the national election. And he's telling the full story from the day after January 6th through the 2022 midterm elections.
Excellent.
That'll be
Excellent.
coming out next summer.
Okay, what's going on in the state houses and around the country, because if 12% of journalists in New York, we got to get people out there. Absolutely. Susan?
And so I'm still doing book events for the Book Bible, and I have an event Friday night if anybody wants to, another in-person event if anyone's around. And then I just, with Ken Chabincivic, we did a middle grade book called World in Between about what it's like to be a 12-year-old Bosnian Muslim refugee landing in this country, and it was based on our adult book, The Bosnia List, and that just came out from HarperCollins.
Okay, fascinating. Repurposing different audience. Okay, Lena.
I'm working on another book that's due kind of early next year. It's a book about alternatives to antibiotics. It sounds very nerdy, but it's actually all character-driven human drama, about 100 years worth of it. And it spans Paris, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, where I spent about 2 weeks earlier this year, kind of resurrecting a story that's about 100 years old. And it's all humans. I recreate all these humans and their tragedies, lives, kids, whatever, in the book, and I'm loving it because this is as close as fiction, except everything is true, that I've ever gotten, and I just can't tell you how much I love it.
Passion, and she's a great storyteller with lots of really strong characters. Mel.
Well, this will probably sound weird because as an agent, I represent, I think I'm known in the industry for doing a ton of, like most of my list is fairly serious nonfiction, books on, big structural problems with society and investigative reporting. But as a prognosticator, I used to be a trend spotter or cool hunter, as Malcolm Gladwell called my old job. And I will say that I think what's coming up in the future of publishing is an old 80s word, glitz. Going with glitz and glamour for the future of publishing.
Could you give us an example of this glitz and glamour? This is not we are not glamorous people here.
I know. So, and maybe this is like I'm like every orphan in the city in American literature. I came from the provinces. I was actually born in Kansas before we moved to Kentucky. But over the summer, like a lot of my fellow people in media, I read Tina Brown's Vanity Fair Diaries and was very inspired for the days of yore. Later probably this week, I'm going to be sending out a novel that's by a best-selling novelist that's set against the backdrop of a high-profile true crime, the Menendez brothers trial, and the writer has connection to the case, and it's set in early 90s Los Angeles at the Chateau Marmont, and Chasen's and Spagos, and all those places that I was probably about 5 when these journalists and big power attorneys and prosecutors and producers and starlets were there. But that's kind of been the mood to read about that world.
Terrific. Glamour.
Glamour.
Aaron, what's up with you?
I am still in the honeymoon phase with my book. It just came out on May 31st. If anybody's at the Brooklyn Book Festival on Sunday, I'll be there with Bell Publishing. We have a table there. I'm starting to outline a new novel. I'm still kind of in the headspace for that. But I am excited for, we talked about this at the very beginning, but just the amount of adult fiction that focuses on queer themes. For a long time, you could count on one hand the comps for a lot of these things. Robert Jones Jr., The Prophets, that was the big Black queer book of last year, National Book Award, a whole bunch of prizes and stuff like that. But it was the only one, not the only one, but it was just like ask anybody to name a gay book, it was that one. This year, there were several queer debut novelists, including my friend Alejandro Varela, who was long listed for the NBA. With The Town of Babylon, but there are multiple brown queer authors. There are multiple Black queer authors. I kind of make a point of saying this because, for a long time, and we all kind of talk amongst this ourselves, but we're kind of starting to say it out loud now. The bar was James Baldwin, and that was it. And James Baldwin died 40 years ago, right? So and then also for queer fiction, the bar was always A Little Life, which is. Depending on what you feel about that book, it was still kind of either the bar was one singular Black author that died many years ago, or one one or two queer books that kind of featured only white characters. So now that door is starting to open a little bit more, I'm excited about what's to come with that.
That is wonderful, and I want to compliment this amazing panel for bringing it in at 8 o'clock. It's all right, I beg you to keep the questions short so we can get the most of these truly amazing panelists. Let's get some questions from the audience. I may have to repeat them. We're going to go 1, 2, 3 in the back with the white shirt. Yeah, no, with your striped shirt. Yes.
So this is a question for the writers mostly, but I have a problem with tinkering too much with my work, and so when did you know your query or your proposal was like ready to be put in front of an agent? Because every morning I get too scared to submit, basically.
I'm going to repeat it for the camera. A writer here says she tinkers too much. How do you know when it's ready for the writers?
I mean, I have two really tough writing groups who hate everything, so when they're like, send it out, you know that it's decent. And also I give myself deadlines, because by the way, I'll pick up a book of mine and I'll start rewriting it and it's been out for 20 years. So you just give yourself a deadline, and you do have to trust, you have colleagues that you trust, and you have to trust your editors and agents to just say, this is good, you could go for it.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything different. You need to have a writer's group that's going to, tear apart everything, right? And when you have an agent, you're working with an agent, once they say, this is ready, it's ready.
Okay, terrific. Emmy, your hand is waiting.
Yeah, I had to, instead of having somebody tear it apart, I had to make somebody push me out the door and be like, this is it.
Pitching, we can all have just like an adverse reaction to pitching, so you keep tinkering to avoid it. Okay, been there. I can see it. Okay. Terrific. Next question in front with the plaid dress.
Hi, my question is for Emmy. With your New York Times piece, which was amazing, did you get a lot of just agents reaching out to you, and ultimately, how did you end up choosing?
So I actually sold. So this is about the New York Times piece, and if I had agents reaching out and how that worked with the book deal. I actually sold acceptance 2 months before that piece came out. And so, I might have gotten a lot more money if I had sold the book later. But yes, so and once you have an agent on your website, there's all these etiquette, and agents really will not reach out to you anymore.
Okay, that is painful. And by the way, the title of the essay is How I'll Never Love a Job Again. More or less.
After working at Google, I'll never let myself love a job again.
Okay. And it really made a splash. And then we had someone over here. A hand, yeah.
Thank you guys so much. My question is, I'm a reporter, I'm a writer of memoir, but the question is there a right age to start working on a memoir or second memoir?
Is there a right age to start working on a memoir? That's a good.
I don't think so. One of my first nonfiction book, I did that when I was 31. That was 7 years ago, and it was not quite a memoir, but it was a lot of personal essays and kind of reflection and whatnot. There's never a right age for any of this, in my opinion. The work speaks for itself.
Yeah, I had, when I was working on 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, I was debating whether to call it a novel or a memoir because I had changed certain names and stuff like that, and a really smart editor said to me, a novel that is merely autobiographical is a great disappointment, but a memoir that reads like a novel is a great surprise. So I think people like Emmy, there's definitely a lot of, Tiffany, if you have a dramatic, Carmen's working on one now, if you have a dramatic story that reads like a novel, doesn't matter at what age you are, go for it. On the other hand, there's a lot of older people that just, if they write, if the memoir is boring and it doesn't read like a novel, put it away and write fiction or do something else.
You have to have something to say. Emmy, I think you're the youngest person on this panel, and you have had your debut a memoir. Are we allowed to ask how old do you say that?
I'm 29.
Okay, so that's the right age to write a memoir. You started 7 years ago when you were 27.
No, I was 22.
Okay.
We're not that major in here.
Okay. Did you have thought about that?
One of my favorite memoirs, which I recommend I've read a younger memoirist, is called Wasted by Maria Hornbacher. I loved this book growing up, and she published it when she was like 24. And it's just so concretely from the specific like time and place of a young person who had an eating disorder like more than half of her life and thought she would never get over it. And it's a brilliant book, and also it's worth reading interviews with the author because I think she largely regrets it as well, because her opinions on it changed, right? Don't take my word for it, like read her stuff, but even with my book, it's like I feel differently than when I turned it in a year ago. So that is an occupational hazard, I think, for being relatively young.
And then you can write another one. Okay. Okay, right here in front.
So I published my first book in December. It's a piece of narrative.
Tell us the title.
It's called Wings of Gold. It's about an experiment in women-enabled aviation in the 70s. The publisher came to me and asked me to write, which I know is totally weird. Maybe because of that, I could not find an agent, couldn't find one, don't have one. Question is, I retained the ancillary rights and the film and TV rights. I have no idea what to do with them. Are there agents?
Publish the book.
Lions Press. Are there agents who will step in that late in the process? Are there people I should call? Any suggestions? I would be eternally grateful.
I'll say that, and by no means am I the industry expert on this, but from my experience, so my publisher has a rights agency. My first 2 books, I didn't have an agent. My third one, I did not have an agent, but I got an agent after that one. So our publisher has a rights agency that's sort of the go-between for smaller presses, like if they're based in the United States and a foreign publisher wants to pick it up or whatever, that rights agency is the liaison between getting that book published in a foreign market or even in Canada or whatever. The rights agency that also works on behalf of my publisher also negotiates like film and TV rights. And like I said, it is not the same across, but the way that ours operates is, they'll look at the slate of titles or whatever and start just shopping it around. Like, oh, we think this book would be good for these producers, or we're going to try to get it in front of these people. So I would reach out to your publisher and see if they do have a rights agency. They didn't have one? Okay, maybe. I would kindly suggest that they look into it, because it does sound interesting.
I'll tell you my experience. My experience is they say, how many books did you sell? And if it's not 10,000 in a month, then they're not interested. But a couple times, I had a book come out, it didn't do that well. I kept writing short pieces, and it happened with Bosnia Liz. And interestingly, if you could take your subject and write something splashy in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post, and you mention the book on the bottom, sometimes you can reinvigorate interest. And I have had a couple books that weren't going to go to paper that I was able to get into paper, and also a couple books that sold audio rights way later than the book came out, based on more press. But I have been told, and let's ask the agent, of course, I have been told that if your book is already out and it didn't sell that well, it's going to be really hard to do that much more with that project. One other thing I'll throw out is that I used to get very, very married to a project, because I know it takes a long time, but it really, really helped me when writer friends said, write your next book, and sometimes, weirdly, that helped. Because if your second book is a bestseller, then it could reinvigorate interest in the other one. But let's ask the agent.
In addition to all of that good advice, I would say if you get an agent for the next book, then they could take on the ancillary rights for the first book. But if it's, having represented a lot of nonfiction, about a very specific topic, which it sounds like your book is, often what happens is a producer comes along and they want to make a film on that, and then they're in Google trying to find out, well, what's the intellectual property associated with this subject, and they will reach out to you. And at that point, it might make sense to have an agent or a lawyer involved.
I can speak to this because I've actually had even New York Times bestselling authors who have just made deals with their publisher directly over the years and doesn't have an agent, and have actually wanted to sell their books to film and TV, but don't really have any connections to do so. So in looking for an agent, I would look also at the agencies that do have a film TV division, because some of the agencies that do will also be able to support that, even if the primary literary agent doesn't have film TV within the agency. They have a film and TV division, like a big one like CAA, for example, that can move the projects onto other agents who can do that kind of work. And they're also in communication with scouts who are doing film to TV work, and they'll do that sort of heavy lifting. So if you are pivoting, I always recommend getting an agent, and even in cases where, as a publisher, I'm reaching out to someone who I want to work with, like my first step will be, can I put you in touch with someone who can manage this process, mediate this process, really on your behalf, is when you are looking for that next step, you know, it's not in the press's best interest because the agent is probably going to ask for more.
Well, she doesn't have an agent though.
No, that's what I'm saying. So like, the press is not going to encourage you to do it, but they should. But if they don't, I would say that if one of your interests is to see the possibility of film and TV in pursuit of an agency, I would look at agents that not only fit the general areas that you're writing it in, but also agencies that have those departments already part of that, so you wouldn't have to split hairs.
I gotta say, the panel really gave incredible advice on this particular one. So thank you everyone for that from many sides. We're gonna take one last question. Okay, in the red hair. Okay, it is red.
Hi, thank you guys so much for your time. This has been such a great panel. I just graduated at NYU's journalism school, so I have a question for the writers. What is one mistake you made early in your career that you're actually grateful?
Whoa! Okay, writers, mistake you're grateful for.
I would say that, remember I mentioned that I had a novel that I really tried to sell for many years and was so frustrated, and then I wound up doing nonfiction. I was really, really lucky. And even when it eventually came out, it wasn't very good, and my nonfiction was better than my fiction. So I will say, you know, if you're getting a lot of rejections on a project, it doesn't mean it's not good or it won't happen, but maybe put it away and try working on something else. Because my experience has been, you know, like Tiffany and you know, I've had a lot of other students who, you know, sometimes you write something and it just works and it's just exciting and it just happens. And, you know, I was going on like 7 years of it not working, and there was a reason why, and I'm really glad I pivoted to nonfiction.
Okay, moving into nonfiction. Anyone else here? And by the way, let's open this to the editors and agents. This is our final question. You know, mistakes that you yourself have done. Okay, Lena?
I don't know if I'm grateful for this mistake. I now, when I look back, I think I should have gone to journalism school a lot earlier. I was just too worried because I was still speaking with accent. My English was still periodically broken, you know, at times, and I was just convinced that the schools wouldn't take me. But I think because I wrote these 4 novels that didn't sell, what I learned is I learned to write long form, about 80,000 words and more. And so when I started writing in journalism, you know, a magazine article of, you know, 3,000 words, 5,000 words, it was nothing. It was, you know, I could just sit down and write it. And when this book sold, and I sat down and said, wait a second, I now have to write it. But wait, it's 80,000 words. I've done this before. All right, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, every chapter 5,000 words. And onwards. So maybe that was sort of my saving grace, that I did all these books early on. I don't know.
Good one.
This kind of echoes something I said earlier, but now that I look back on it, a mistake I made right out of J school was, again, comparing myself to folks that I thought were doing better than me. Like, I went to Michigan State, a college in the Midwest, and you know, peers at U of M and places like those, they were going on to like New York Times and Chicago Tribune and all these places, and I just kind of felt like I was stuck at home. And in the long run, a lot of those people got laid off from places like this. Yeah, journalism, right? Also, I mean, staying where I was at, I did kind of like, I went against kind of the norm of like staying at one employer for a very long time, which is what they told a lot of us coming out of J school at the time. It's just like, you have to, to build your career here. I bounced around to different disciplines. Like I did automotive writing, I did digital media when it was kind of in that straddling, like right coming out of the recession, and should we charge for newspapers or not, and stuff like that. I did a bunch of different topics. I bounced around. I did magazine writing. I was a magazine editor. I did newspapers. I did online. You know, so even a little bit of broadcast. I did a radio piece. So going back, like I'm kind of glad I didn't kind of go on that particular trajectory. Staying at home, I built my career at home, and it paid off. So I was able to kind of, in every little secret, every job I went to and every experience I had, in my head I was like, everybody's a character, right? Like these are all like different personalities that I can fictionalize later in my fiction work, right? So yeah, I mean, it all kind of goes back to not comparing yourself to others, which I think is, especially looking, I'm not that old yet, but looking back as a younger journalist, I was very much in the habit of, and I always tell people, stop looking at what the next person is doing.
Okay, that's wonderful. What felt like mistakes at the time turned out to be what built his power. I would like to get Emmy, Melissa, and Pronoi to get a final word in. You know, say whatever you want, but I really want to make sure Melissa, and if anyone has a question specifically for Melissa, Emmy, or Pronoi, you can ask that now, but we got to move it along. Okay, or we're just going to have wrap it up.
Yeah. When I was writing acceptance, my goal was I want to sell this book ASAP. Like I have to sell it. My life is on hold until I do. And in that process, I started asking people for feedback. And I think I gave it to more than 100 readers. And like I would meet someone at a restaurant, like a mom, and I'd be like, "You're a mom, you have a kid, I think you want to read this book." and I basically took all of the feedback, and somebody would like make a suggestion, and I would like incorporate it in the draft. And I mean, it was a huge mistake in that I went down all these rabbit holes. I suffered like needlessly. These were my nights and weekends while I worked full-time as a software engineer. But I actually am grateful that for this first book, I did that process because it put me really in touch with my audience, and it made me really think about like what are people looking for when they're reading a book, both on like the story level and on like the big idea level. And I think as writers and journalists, we can often be inside our own little bubble of like our writing group, our editing group of New York people. And so having that cross-section of Americans was really useful for me.
Very interesting. Mel?
I would go back to the question of mistakes that we made. Hopefully this is applicable to all the writers in the room. Back when I was starting out, for various reasons, I had tons of interest. I have no shortage of ideas for books like Pronoi. I did young adult fiction and serious nonfiction and sort of practical and everything in between, but I was still under some pressure from my former agency to chase whatever the latest trend was, whether it was like chick lit or whatever. And I think I wasted a fair amount of time doing that instead of sticking with the subjects and the projects that I really had a vision for. And I definitely learned to sort of stick with my instincts and develop the projects in a pretty diverse range of categories, and then eventually end up at an agency where that was a better fit. But I think that could be, I know a lot of journalists especially feel like they're chasing whatever the latest beat is or the trend, and so I think that hopefully applies.
That's very true. Pronoi, you're going to get the last word.
That's intimidating because everyone here has been saying such great things. But one thing I will say is that when I first began this process, and I do believe this applies to authors because it's first time authors, I tell them this a lot, is no publisher can really guarantee success. I mean, outside of celebrities and people with you're on TV, Jake Tapper or something would be fine. But I'm a little brand publisher, Jake Tapper, so I can see it in person. It's pretty good to be on TV every night. to sell books. But what we can control is the collaboration, the intimacy of the relationship that will last through highs and lows, a lot of which can be psychologically traumatizing to exuberant. And it's extremely important to recognize that the people that you'll be working with, whether it's your agent, whether it's your editor, is not someone who's just going to be like coldly involved with you on this project, but will be with you in a very deep and meaningful way. And like nobody really taught me this, you don't really learn this, you kind of learn this on the fly, but you often do have to play therapist sometimes, you have to play like, reality check sometimes. It's like, hey, it's like, I'm sorry, like the New York Times isn't moving on this, like we can't decide to make them do something. So like, and editorially, like, sometimes you have to say like it's not working, and how do you do that in the best possible way? So you're gonna really have to build trust. And so, the first agent that reaches out to you, you should feel completely motivated to ask questions that you want answered. Like if they're trying to make you something that you're not, that is not a long-term relationship that will be beneficial to you. If they say you are, a kind of writer that I see in X, and you're like, well, I don't see myself at all, then that's not somebody who wants to speak on your behalf. And so for me, like, it's very important too when I communicate with authors, is this an author that would trust me when I say, let's take it this direction, or let's go further here, like, what do you think of that? And if they respond very dynamically with a sense of curiosity, or they look at me, that's a horrible idea. Like, I also understand that, like, maybe I'm not the best person to work with them, because that level of trust, I think, is something that is irreplaceable, and you can't predict success, but you can build trust. And so I'd say the first agent that contacts you, don't get so excited, like, oh, it's game changer, like they might not be the right agent for you. And that applies to editors, that applies to publishers, all publishers do different things, some better than others, and you really want to trust that in all of these relationships that you build, that they become people that have your best interest at heart and are also willing to listen to you, as well as you're willing to listen to them. So like you also want to be with someone that you trust their guidance. Like it might be painful, but they seem right, and they haven't taken me astray before. And I've made the mistake of just like jumping in with authors just because I felt like it was right, it was a trend chasing, or trying to appeal to a very prominent agent like Mel. I'm just like, I gotta buy a book from Mel, so and there, it hasn't happened with Mel actually. We're gonna have a book together. The authors love it. But where there's just not this like synergy, and like the author like loses trust. There's nothing worse than an author like completely freezing up because they feel like nothing they're doing is right. It's completely counterproductive. So I feel like for us, we see this, and like I think writers too should also have the confidence to like also play the field a bit, like talk to multiple people.
Ronoy, this is wonderful advice. to end our evening on, that you have to click with your writer. And you have to click with your agent, and you have to click with the people you're working with, and to hold out for them. Before, I'm going to ask you to hold your applause. I am going to quote Sue Shapiro right now, who talks about being a good book citizen. What?
Good literary citizen.
Literary citizen. And that means tonight, please, go buy some of these books. Do not let Postman independent booksellers schlep those books home. They had a dolly, and it looked very heavy. So the books will be there if you want to meet the speakers, which I hope you do, or get a signing, or talk to our agent and editor. Bring a book with you if you can. Very quick, Deadline Club, we have a mixer October 16th. We have an amazing literary food and wine writing evening with natural wine expert Alice Faring and Melissa Clark. New York Times, November 15th. To find out more about our club, you can go to our website, talk to our membership chair, Polly Wurzel. And now it is time for an amazing round of applause for this exceptional